Hey everybody, I think it's time for a SleepyVlog. I don't think I've ever done one outside of my little man cave office before. And I may be a little even less focused than usual. For any newer viewers of my channel in SleepyVlogs, because everything I do really is a vlog, right? It's just my comic book vlog. But in the official vlogs, I drift from subject to subject of things in comics I've been thinking about, rather than focus on new comics that have just come out or whatever, or hauls or whatever. So this is just a hodgepodge of things I've been thinking about in comics. First of all, I want to give a big shout out of appreciation to someone who actually hasn't been making many videos lately, and that's Hulk's Big Toe, Paul, over in England. Sometimes I forget that he's not making that many videos anymore because he's on Twitter all the time in a little group of us who know each other from YouTube but are twittering back and forth all day long about comic books. And I encourage you to follow me on Twitter if you would like to be part of that conversation. I only follow back people who I can figure out that I know from YouTube or something. So yeah, if your name's not obvious on Twitter and the description and your description on Twitter isn't obvious, then I might not follow you, and I apologize for that. You can let me know that it's you, and that would help, because I just don't want to follow a million people talking about a million things that I'm not interested in. A lot of people on Twitter seem to have discovered me and followed me because I mention comic books on my Twitter, and they're trying to market their comic book. And while I'm all for people trying to market their own independent comics, I don't want to follow all of them either, because I don't want all that white noise in my Twitter stream. I just want to talk to people who are fellow comic book chatters. Anyway, lately I think Paul's had to drop his pull list. I think maybe he's getting an occasional comic book here and there. He's going through a really hard time in his personal life, and I assume that includes a tightening of his budget. So, I don't know, Paul, if you're still watching videos, or maybe right now you don't want to because you can't buy the comics. But if you are, this is a big salute out to you. I miss your videos. Always thought of you as a great guy, and however we're friends here on Twitter, I think of you as a great person to be a friend with. I feel bad today because today is Thursday, and Wednesday I couldn't go get my comics. I'm trying to figure out a way to go get them sooner, but I will probably not be able to get them till Saturday, sometime on Saturday. And it's just because of the extra craziness of my family's schedule during the summer. Between my daughter not being at school and my wife getting a lot more work at her job during the summer, which is at all kinds of odd hours at night and early in the morning and on the weekends and all of that. So yeah, I feel bad that I can't get my comics. I'll be 4 days late on getting my comics, which is silly because some people, like Hulk's Big Toe, maybe can't get their comics at all. I know that there are other people out there who either don't have jobs or live in places where they can't get comic books in an affordable way who watch my channel. So I feel kind of guilty, but I've really got that Wednesday habit. And I've always read lots of comics, but I haven't always had the Wednesday habit. And that thrill of picking up comic books every Wednesday is so bolstered by all my friends on Twitter and all my friends on YouTube. Oh, look, a pen. That is just really exciting to go in on Wednesday and grab them. And also now I'm much more aware than I used to be about books that maybe I'll miss if they sell out. Hopefully they'll still have Spread there. I've decided to try the first issue of Spread, so hopefully that doesn't sell out. On the sort of opposite flip side of things, they only get a few kids' comics, and I noticed that this month's issue of Archie looked like one my daughter would enjoy. She loves Betty and Veronica, but this Archie seems... Yeah, I forget what it's about. Something where Archie can't do it as well as Betty and Veronica, or something like that. So I wanted to get that for my daughter, but they only get 2 or 3 copies at my store, so that might be hard to find. And some other things not on my pull list that I wanted to get, which hopefully will still be there. So yeah, that Wednesday Habit's really sticking with me this time. I keep trying to convince myself to get more graphic novels, or get more collections, more trades. Save money, might read better in many cases. No ads. We've discussed this all ad infinitum. I've heard some people talk about going more to trades lately, like Dark Nate. And but I can't shake the Wednesday Habit. Like Spread. I mean, even if Spread is to my taste, I should get that in trades. It's going to be a $3.50 book. There's another one coming up, Low, I think it's called, by Rick Remender. It's going to be a $4 a month book. So those both would make a lot of sense in trade, but it would be a lot of fun to pick them up monthly. And I'm talking about image books, but I seem to be slipping back deeper into the DC swimming pool with, as I've mentioned, the weeklies of Batman Eternal and Future's End. So that's 2 DC books every week automatically on in my stack that weren't there before. And now I'm hearing some more stuff about World's End. Is it World's End? Anyway, the 3rd one that they're going to do, which is going to tie into Earth 2. And now the lead writer on it's going to be Tom Taylor, who has been so kick-ass on Injustice and on the regular Earth 2 title. So that makes me want it more. And there was something else they said about it, I can't remember now, that made me really tempted. And these tie in so much to the Wednesday Habit being weekly. They might not be as good in trades. They might just be more fun spooling out weekly, especially Batman Eternal is definitely that way. It's going to read so uneven when you put it all together. But it's just fun each week to see what's going to happen next, how they're going to do it next, what the artist will be. I don't like the radically changing art styles, but the what next kind of feel of it is just really strong with a weekly comic. It does seem like that makes things even harder to jump on. It feels like you have to read all 60 issues of Batman Eternal. They haven't done it in a way where there are distinct story arcs that you could just, okay, now they've wrapped up one story arc in issue 10, say, of Batman Eternal. Now you can read the next 10 issues. They haven't done it that way. So I'm thinking that will increase the shrinking sales, the shrinking returns on comics over time. So if they did it a slightly different way, I would think weekly comics could be more successful as a long-term endeavor. Because you got to have jump-on points, I think. Which kind of, yeah, I had a little list over here on the side. I'm skipping around already. But that ties into, some of you may have seen, and I'll link below, to the episode of Wednesday Serial where he read 4 issues of Kamandi that I gave him digitally, because it costs next to nothing. Because I can't afford to send people the first 4 issues of Kamandi, the real thing. That'd be a little expensive. But Matt, Wednesday Serial, had been resisting reading Kamandi because he wanted to read it starting with issue number 1. And a lot of other people chimed in on his video, saying, I can only read a comic book if I get in on issue number 1. So that's a whole jump-on problem. But that's a real problem reading old comic books, because Kamandi was written for people to jump on constantly on every issue. and Kamandi and Jack Kirby's Fourth World, the Fourth World even more, had some continuing stuff that it was a little bit helpful to know about before you read the current issue. But other comics were even more, back then, designed to be the only issue you ever read. Or maybe you'd read issue 50, and then the next issue you'd find would be issue 53, but they would write it so that you could pick up on what's happened, fill in the gaps. My whole childhood and young adulthood comic book reading experiences were that way. Graphic novels didn't exist, digital obviously didn't exist. Finding back issues was difficult and possibly expensive relative to one's budget at the time if you were a kid. And comic book stores, for most people, didn't exist. It depends what era. If you started reading comics in the 80s, there began to be more comic book stores around. You might have been lucky to have been in a town with comic book stores. And by the late 80s and early 90s, there were probably tons of comic book stores around. And then you could potentially buy the back issues. But like with Kamandi, yeah, there's some setup in the first early issues, introducing some characters who then reoccur later on, are reintroduced. And you might have a little bit more background with them, but not much, and there's no long-term arc that you're missing pieces of, or anything like that. Now, the New Gods is maybe the one exception to that, of comics from the 70s. So, I probably shouldn't have stopped to chew on these crunchy things. I can't even hear myself talk. So I've also been listening, well, for a long time to this podcast called Wait What? And one of the things they do on that is every episode they discuss 10 more issues of the Avengers. They started from Avengers number 1 and they're now over Avengers 100. Reading them all in order. And complaining miserably about how terrible they are most of the time, until they get to Steve Englehart and his run. But a lot of that is because of the repetitiveness and that the comic books were not read to be read 10 in a row. They were read to be one issue here, one issue there. They did not assume that someone reading issue 90 would ever get to read issue 75. So that, one, they repeated a lot of plot elements, the characters remained relatively the same, all kinds of things. So it's really dangerous to read old comic books in a row. Like you might, this is right in front of me, you want to read Mercenary Sea from number 1 and on, and it's like reading a novel to an extent. It's not at all like, or even more so, Sovereign, which is written like a big fat fantasy novel. But it was not at all like that. To feel like you have to go back and start with Avengers number 1 or you can't read the Avengers is almost an act of stupidity. Or so it seems to me. Everything, I would guess, written before 1980, and a lot of stuff written after 1980, was written for sampling, for picking up bits here and there. But it's interesting because now the world is so different, and you have the opportunity, one way or another, to track down things, get graphic novels. Libraries have them all. So it makes a lot more sense now to write things as if people can start from the beginning. And so, especially people maybe who started reading comics in the last 20 years, or the last 15 years, or the last 10 years, they're now in the habit, they think about comics as if they have to read them from number 1. But I couldn't have read, I think in the time of my first comic book reading, which would have been ages 9 to 16, because at 16 I decided I needed the money for gas, and that girl, I didn't want anyone to know about me reading comic books, mostly girls, maybe boys too. Anyway, during that period, I probably only got 1 or 2 number 1 issues at all. Number 1s were unusual. More often than not, a comic book would just change its title in mid-run. So you have lots of comics like the Hulk, and Thor, and Captain America that do not start at number 1 if you look back at the old comics. Not that I was reading comic books when those ones started up. But you get my point. And in fact, they would... I guess, like, I got Warlock number 1, but Warlock number 1 was not, the Gil Kane... I don't know if it was Jerry Conway or Roy Thomas. Anyway, I think it was Roy Thomas at first. And often these things start with Roy Thomas, then get passed on to other people. But Warlock number 1 was not the real number 1. The real number 1 was one of the issues of, I think, Marvel Premiere. I think they had 2 issues of Warlock and Marvel Premiere, and then they felt it was popular enough, or they decided to take a risk on it, and then they did a number 1. So, even if you find number 1s of things from the 70s, they aren't really the beginning of the story, if you have to read the story from the beginning. I don't know what originally made me think of that. Yeah, it bothered me a lot on that podcast when they did not take the context into account, and they acted as if Roy Thomas, for instance, was this idiot, and they did not acknowledge that he was writing for children, and they did not acknowledge that he was writing for an audience that, as far as he knew, churned over every year, and that most of them were not able to get every issue. You just kind of randomly, when you wound up somewhere where there was a newsstand, looked at the comics to see what was there. And distribution was kind of funky, and I tried comparing, like the very first comic book I ever read was Avengers 93, so I looked on a website to see what other comics came out the month of Avengers 93, because I have this intense memory of looking at the spinner rack that it was on and trying to decide which comic book to read. And I knew that another one was a Conan issue with Conan hanging from the horns of a giant bull, and that definitely did not officially come out the same month as Avengers 93. It came out several months before or after. So things were just really jumbled up back then, and now we've got this Wednesday kind of habit where when comic books come out, what comics are going to come out for the most part, or it's easy to find out if you want to. People are, in our little crowd on Twitter on Tuesday and Monday saying, what are you going to get this Wednesday? And it's a whole different thing. And so comic books are written in a whole different way because of that. Also on Twitter, I found out this morning that Gail Simone and the artist working with her, who I really like, whose name I can't quite remember right now, are leaving Batwoman with issue 34, so in 2 issues. Not counting the 3D month. And, now I'm going to forget their names. Some other people are taking over. The writers of it are... The artist is a brand new artist to comics, I believe, but her art looks pretty cool. The writers are Cameron Stewart, who I believe is just an artist in the past, and another person who's written very little. And I was complaining a lot on Twitter, and people were kind of thinking I was just being a whiny brat for complaining about something changing. But I feel if I can't complain on Twitter, where can I? I feel like I was starting to really get into Batgirl. Have I been saying Batwoman all along? Batgirl by Gail Simone. Starting to get into it, and she would keep getting interrupted by events, and this and that, Gothtopia, guest-written issues, and she was just beginning to rev her engines up again, and now it's going to be over. And I feel really frustrated with that, because I've been hanging on to Batgirl for the good, for the bits of good stuff that I thought was going to finally pay off. And now that's not going to happen. So it's like you're climbing up that hill, sliding down the hill, climbing up that hill, sliding down the hill, and then they just have removed the hill. So I'll never see what's at the top of the hill. And the new Batgirl is, they've redesigned her costume, and in the drawings I saw, she looks like maybe an 18-year-old girl at the most, or 16 to 18-year-old girl, very teenagery. And she's supposedly going to be going to graduate school and moving to this funky, chic neighborhood of Gotham with up-and-coming rock bands and cafes and record stores and groovy things like that. And when I read the description, I live in Portland, Oregon, I thought, that sounds exactly like Portland, Oregon, and they were going to call the neighborhood Burnside. And if you live in Portland, Oregon, you know that Burnside Street is the major street that divides all of the city. And of late, there's areas of Burnside full of all that hip cafe, nightclub, restaurant kind of stuff. So I think it literally is someone's moving Portland to become a neighborhood of Gotham City, which to me feels ridiculous. A lot of comic book creators have moved to Portland, and apparently Cameron Stewart lives here. But, well, A, that's not Gotham. So they're moving her out of Gotham while keeping her in Gotham. B, as someone who's lived in Portland for 22 years, I'm kind of irritated by the people who've moved here to Portland and are so proud of themselves for living in Portland. Ooh, aren't we groovy? We have funky restaurants. Don't get me wrong, I like Portland. I like to hang out at cafes. I used to have time to go see lots of bands at nightclubs. Maybe you could transfer some of that to Gotham, but don't make it exactly like Portland, and don't call it Burnside. It's like they're trying to name check because they think it makes them cool. So that irritates me. But it also, Gail Simone, a really experienced writer, is leaving Batgirl without, well, for me, this is just me. I can't say they have to have Gail Simone on it. But anyway, she's being replaced by people who I think, in a sense, are rank beginners as writers of comic books. And shouldn't they have to work their way up a little bit? Or Batgirl is being regulated, made into more of a side character off to the side, maybe. But the same, really, with Wonder Woman. I mean, she's getting a top-level artist in exchange for having a writer, the artist's wife, who has she's written 3 comic books in the past. I haven't read them. They might not even be whole comics. They might be comics within anthologies or something. But for one of the real lower-level publishers, too, known for exploitation material. So for her to be writing Wonder Woman, maybe she'll do a great job, and I'm going to definitely give her a chance. I'm thinking strongly about just dropping Batgirl when Gail Simone leaves. Because it gives me opportunity maybe to, their Batwoman, I keep saying Batgirl in Portland might be kind of fun for a while as a novelty. But there's lots of other great stuff to buy, so I may take it off my pull, but just pick it up off the stands once or twice to see how it is. But I think it's a mistake. It reminds me of the worst periods of maybe Marvel and Image, where they kind of thought anyone could write a comic book. You just get any editorial assistant to take over, and just have the artist write it. There are some great artist writers, and in fact, that's kind of my ideal, like Will Eisner or Jack Kirby or Frank Miller or Darwin Cook. But let them prove themselves somewhere, because a lot of the artists just don't turn out to have really what it takes to be a writer. I think one reason why comics since the 90s, maybe since the very late 90s or early 2000s, have become much better in the writing is because they, for instance, at Marvel, I know Joe Quesada forbid the having editors write the scripts. So it used to be you just have your friend, the editor at the next desk over, write the script for your comic book. And generally they've gotten in the habit of recruiting people with some solid writing experience from somewhere else, or people like Rick Remender or Michael Bendis or Jeff Lemire, who have worked for a long time on their own indie comics and proved that they have a lot of talent as writers. Just giving an artist a writing gig, or giving a student of Scott Snyder a writing gig, to me it's pushing down the level of writing. And two of the writers who I dislike the most at DC are writers who also, I believe, came up in the 90s in that sort of work in the editorial staff and slowly get yourself writing jobs, being Scott Lobdell and Ann Nocenti. So it's funny that I'm being drawn more back into DC, but I see a lot of problems with DC. I don't see these problems at Marvel. Marvel does have other problems, which I've discussed before, the Disney pressures, and then just the prices that are too high for me, and the intensity of their crossovers. But I think in terms of who they choose to be writers and their approach to writers, I think Marvel does a better job. And I hope that DC doesn't fall deeper into this sort of cronyism and just giving artists writing jobs. They do have Becky Cloonan coming on for her first job as far as I know, as a writer, not an artist. She's done some indie comics where she's written and drawn. The ones I've read of those were kind of good, but they were kind of like little mythic fairy tales. So whether she'll be able to write an ongoing comic book or not, she's supposed to be writing Gotham Academy. So whether she's the right writer for that or not, I'll give that a try. I wish she was drawing it. I've probably, can I see the time here? I've probably really gone on long. The iPad does not tell me how long the video's been running, which is a bit weird. Oh yes, it does now as I try to touch it. 28 minutes. Wow. So I'm not going to get to all the subjects I was planning to. Yeah, so I assert, just to get back to, I assert the right to complain on Twitter or complain in these videos when I don't like changes going on in comics. Sure, changes happen, but this is a vlog. These are places to vent your feelings. It is, and I think on Twitter, Sarah Smash was mentioning, oh, I see now, you don't get good closure with comic books. It is an ongoing problem with comic books that something gets going good, and then it's the writer leaves, the artist leaves, whoever leaves. That is partially why I am jumping on so much Image, because I feel like those writers and artists are going to stay. So yeah, and yet I'm falling back deep into the DC pool. I'll end it there. I was going to also talk about some issues of the recurring issue of creators' rights and, the old creators from long ago and everything. A bunch of people have been talking about that, and it kind of tied in with the way old comic books were made, and how it's weird to judge them, read them in a volume of books and judge them the way you would judge, 10 issues of a current comic. But people were, back then, they were writing and drawing and pumping out comic books to these very tight deadlines in large quantities, very hastily, and they were paid in the way that was the tradition in the old pulp magazines, which is you just got a check, and if you signed the back of the check, it was assumed that meant you signed a contract, even though the full contract was not. Sometimes a small bit of the contract was printed on the back of the check, but you were not signing the full contract. And you were just cashing that check and going on and proceeding to pump out the next issue. And I think back then, it felt to people you had to create new characters. That was part of how you just got jobs, and maybe they felt if you kept creating characters and doing a good job, you'd have kind of a certain kind of security. And people who are arguing that people shouldn't be trying to get back creators' rights, because it's like if you worked for IBM and you invented a new computer, IBM would own that computer. But IBM was giving you a salary, giving you benefits, pension, insurance. If they fired you, they'd have to pay unemployment. And none of that was true for freelancers. And the definitions of how freelancers' work was owned under the law before the 70s was actually quite different than it is now. But most of the people working in the comic book industry didn't even know what their rights were and weren't really thinking about it because they just had to get that next paycheck one way or another. They were scrambling. And why this came up recently was in a bunch of different things, from podcasts and from Itanik One's discussions of it. And the Jack Kirby family is going to the Supreme Court now. So, yeah, I'm fading out. I'll try to do another vlog relatively soon. Pull these threads back together and talk about some other things. I hope you guys are all doing well, and I hope I find some time to read my comic books. Talk to you all later. Bye-bye.